the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe. A massive American fighter plane lumbers through the clouds, its bulky fuselage and enormous radial engine making it look more like a flying milk jug than a sleek fighter aircraft. German Luftwaffe pilots spot it from their nimble Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf Fw 190s, and they smile. Die Jug, they call it mockingly. The Jug. Because it looks fat, heavy, slow, easy prey for their superior fighters. They've heard the American pilots call it the Thunderbolt, but the Germans have another name for it. Das fliegende Bierfass, the flying beer barrel. They laugh at its appearance. They dismiss it as another clumsy American attempt to compete with German engineering excellence. They dive to attack, confident in their kill. And then the American pilot pushes the throttle forward. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine roars to life with 2,000 horsepower, and suddenly that fat fighter is accelerating like nothing they've ever seen. The P-47 Thunderbolt rolls into a dive, and the German pilots realize too late that they've made a terrible mistake. 8 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, open fire. The combined rate of fire is over 100 rounds per second. The weight of fire is devastating. When all 8 guns converge on a target, it's like getting hit by a metal storm. German fighters disintegrate. Wings fold. Fuselages explode. Pilots who thought they were hunting prey suddenly become the hunted. The Thunderbolt wasn't a joke. It was a flying fortress with the firepower of a destroyer and the ruggedness of a tank. And the Germans were about to learn that the hard way. This is the story of how the P-47 Thunderbolt went from being mocked to being feared. This is the story of the fighter that changed the air war over Europe. This is the story of the plane that German pilots learned to respect, or die. The birth of a giant. To understand why the P-47 looked so different from other fighters, we need to go back to its origins in the late 1930s. Republic Aviation Corporation, led by designer Alexander Kartveli, was tasked with creating a new fighter for the U.S. Army Air Corps. But there was a problem. American aircraft designers were obsessed with lightweight, nimble fighters like the British Spitfire. The prevailing wisdom was that fighters needed to be small and agile to dogfight effectively. Kartveli disagreed. He believed the future of air combat would be fought at high altitudes where heavy bombers operated. He believed American fighters would need to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. And he believed that to do this, a fighter needed range, firepower, and the ability to take punishment. So Kartveli designed something revolutionary, a fighter built around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. But there was a problem with radial engines. They were big. Really big. To house this massive engine and provide the pilot with adequate visibility, the fuselage had to be enormous. The result was an aircraft that looked nothing like a traditional fighter. When the prototype XP-47B first flew on May 6, 1941, people were stunned by its size. It weighed over 12,000 pounds empty, nearly twice as much as a Spitfire. Fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, it could weigh over 17,000 pounds. For comparison, that was heavier than some twin-engine bombers. Critics immediately dismissed it. It's too big, they said. Too heavy, too unwieldy. It'll never be able to dogfight with German fighters. But Kartveli had designed something special. Yes, the P-47 was big, but it was also incredibly strong. Its airframe could handle stresses that would tear other fighters apart. Its radial engine was air-cooled, meaning it could take tremendous battle damage and keep running. Unlike the liquid-cooled inline engines used in most fighters, which would fail catastrophically if a coolant line was hit. And most importantly, it was fast. At altitude, with that massive engine roaring, the P-47 could reach speeds over 400 mph, faster than most German fighters at high altitude. The U.S. Army Air Forces ordered the P-47 into production. By 1942, Thunderbolts were rolling off assembly lines. By early 1943, they were being shipped to England to join the 8th Air Force in the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. The Germans were about to meet the Jug, First Blood. The rocky start, April 15, 1943. RAF Debden, England, the 4th Fighter Group, a unit composed largely of American pilots who had previously flown with the Royal Air Force's Eagle squadrons, received their first P-47 Thunderbolts. These pilots were experienced, having flown the Spitfire 5 in combat. They knew what a good fighter felt like, and when they first climbed into the P-47's cockpit, they were not impressed. "It's like sitting on top of a damn house," one pilot complained. The cockpit was positioned far back on the fuselage behind that massive engine. Visibility forward and down was terrible compared to the Spitfire. "It handles like a truck," another said after his first flight. At low altitude and low speed, the P-47 was heavy and sluggish. It couldn't turn as tightly as the Spitfire. It couldn't climb as quickly at low altitude. The American pilots were frustrated. They'd been given this enormous, cumbersome fighter and told to go fight the highly experienced Luftwaffe pilots flying nimble Bf-109s and Fw-190s. It seemed like a suicide mission. On April 15, 1943, the 4th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission in P-47s, an escort mission for B-17 bombers. The mission was uneventful. They didn't encounter German fighters, but the pilots came back even more skeptical. "If we'd run into 109s, we'd be dead," they said. But then, on May 4, 1943, everything changed. The tide begins to turn May 4, 1943, over the English Channel. A formation of P-47 Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group was escorting bombers when they encountered a large formation of German Fw-190 fighters. The German pilots, seeing these bulky American fighters for the first time in significant numbers, attacked with confidence. But something unexpected happened. The American pilots, remembering their training, did something the Germans didn't anticipate. They dove. One of the P-47's greatest strengths was its dive performance. That massive engine and heavy airframe meant it could dive faster and longer than almost any other fighter in the war. When a P-47 pushed into a dive, it accelerated rapidly, and its strong airframe meant it could handle the stress without breaking apart. The German Fw-190 pilots dove after them, confident they could catch these slow American planes. But the P-47s pulled away. The Germans couldn't keep up. And when the Thunderbolts leveled out and turned back, those 850 caliber machine guns opened fire. The Americans scored their first kills in the P-47 Thunderbolt that day, and more importantly, they discovered the key to fighting in this massive fighter. Use its strengths, speed in the dive, incredible firepower, and rugged construction, and avoid prolonged turning dogfights at low altitude where its weight was a disadvantage. Word spread quickly among American fighter pilots. The P-47 wasn't a Spitfire, and you couldn't fly it like one. But if you used it correctly, fighting with slashing attacks, boom and zoom tactics, using altitude and speed, it was absolutely deadly. The Germans were starting to learn this too, and they didn't like what they were learning. 8 guns of thunder. Let's talk about what made the P-47's firepower so devastating. The Thunderbolt was armed with 8 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Each gun had a rate of fire of approximately 800 rounds per minute. When all 8 fired together, they produced a combined rate of fire of over 100 rounds per second. But it wasn't just the rate of fire that made them deadly, it was the weight of fire. The 50 caliber round was enormous compared to the 30 caliber or even .303 caliber rounds used in many other fighters. Each bullet weighed about 1.5 ounces and traveled at over 2,900 feet per second. When it hit a target, it didn't just punch a hole, it transferred massive kinetic energy, causing devastating damage. American pilots called it the ripsaw. When you fired all 8 guns, the sound was like a massive saw cutting through metal. The tracers, every 5th round was a tracer for aiming purposes, looked like 8 streams of fire converging on the target. German pilots who survived encounters with P-47s described the experience as terrifying. One Luftwaffe pilot reported, "When the Thunderbolt opened fire, it was like being attacked by a flak battery. The tracers were everywhere. If even one hit your aircraft, the damage was catastrophic." The 850 caliber guns could tear wings off fighters, aircraft punch through engine blocks, shred control surfaces, destroy fuel tanks, kill pilots through armored seats, but it got even better, or worse if you were German. Each P-47 carried between 267 and 425 rounds per gun, depending on the model. That meant a pilot had substantial ammunition, enough for multiple engagements without returning to base, and the guns were harmonized, aimed to converge at a specific distance, typically 300 yards. At that range, all 8 streams of 50 caliber bullets would meet at a single point, creating a cone of destruction about 6 feet in diameter. If you were a German pilot and a P-47 got you in its sights at convergence range, you had seconds to live. The Germans stopped laughing. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe had fought enough P-47s to revise their initial assessment. Intelligence reports from captured German pilots and intercepted communications revealed a dramatic shift in attitude. Initially, the American Thunderbolt is heavy and cumbersome. Avoid its initial attack, then engage in turning combat where our fighters' superior maneuverability will prevail. By late 1943, the P-47 is extremely dangerous. Do not engage in diving combat. Do not pursue if it dives away. Its firepower is devastating. Exercise extreme caution. German fighter pilots were taught specific tactics for dealing with P-47s. Never follow it into a dive. The P-47 will outdive you and can turn the tables. Try to force it into low-altitude turning combat. This is where the P-47 is weakest. If you're being pursued by a P-47, dive and turn simultaneously. The P-47's heavy weight makes it slow to change direction. Avoid head-on attacks. The P-47's 8 guns give it overwhelming firepower advantage, but even with these tactics, P-47s were racking up impressive kill ratios. The aircraft that had been mocked was now feared. One German ace, Lieutenant Hans Ossi Hahn, who flew the Fw-190, said after the war, "When we first saw the P-47, we thought the Americans were crazy. Such a big, heavy fighter. But after a few encounters, we learned to respect it. The Thunderbolt could take incredible punishment and keep flying. And if it got you in its sights, well, you didn't walk away from that." Ace of aces, Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski. To truly understand what the P-47 was capable of, we need to talk about the men who flew it. And no one exemplified the Thunderbolt's deadly effectiveness better than Colonel Francis Stanley Gabby Gabreski. Gabreski was born to Polish immigrants in Oil City, Pennsylvania. He joined the Army Air Corps in 1940 and completed flight training in 1941. After Pearl Harbor, he was initially assigned to fly P-40 Warhawks in Hawaii, but he requested a transfer to a combat unit. In early 1943, Gabreski arrived in England and was assigned to the 56th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts. Like many pilots, he was initially skeptical of the big fighter. But after his first few combat missions, he began to understand its potential. Gabreski scored his first kill on August 24, 1943, shooting down a Fw-190 over France. But it was what happened next that made him legendary. Over the following year, Gabreski perfected the art of flying the P-47. He understood that the key was energy management, maintaining speed and altitude advantage, making slashing attacks, and using the P-47's superior dive speed to escape when necessary. He also became expert at using the P-47's devastating firepower. Gabreski didn't waste ammunition. He would close to within 200-300 yards, sometimes even closer, before opening fire. At that range, with all 8 guns converging, his target simply disintegrated. By July 1944, Gabreski had shot down 28 German aircraft, making him the top American ace in Europe at that time. He would have likely scored more, but on July 20, 1944, his luck ran out, not in air combat, but during a strafing run. He flew too low, his prop struck the ground, and he was forced to crash land in German-occupied territory. He spent the rest of the war as a POW. But Gabreski's record stood as testament to what a skilled pilot could do in a P-47 Thunderbolt. He proved that the Jug wasn't just effective. In the right hands, it was the deadliest fighter in the sky. After the war, Gabreski said, "The P-47 was the best fighter of the war. It could take incredible damage. I came back from missions with hundreds of holes in my aircraft. Any other plane would have gone down. The Thunderbolt brought me home. The rugged survivor." One of the P-47's most remarkable characteristics was its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. Pilots called it the most survivable fighter in the air. There are countless stories of P-47s coming home with damage that would have destroyed other aircraft. Robert S. Johnson's miracle. On June 26, 1943, ace Robert S. Johnson was jumped by a German Fw-190 flown by the experienced pilot Egon Meyer. Johnson's P-47 was hit repeatedly. Over 200 rounds struck his aircraft. His canopy was shattered. He was wounded. His controls were damaged. The Fw-190 pilot closed in for the kill and pulled alongside to finish Johnson off. But Johnson slumped forward in his seat, playing dead. The German pilot, thinking Johnson was finished, broke off and flew away. Johnson nursed his battered P-47 back to England and made an emergency landing. When maintenance crews examined his aircraft, they couldn't believe it was still flying. The tail section was nearly shot off. There were holes everywhere, but that massive radial engine was still running, and the tough airframe held together. Johnson went on to become one of the top American aces with 27 kills, almost all in the P-47. Mike, the giant killer Gladich. On August 24, 1944, Polish pilot Mike Gladich, flying with American forces, was hit by anti-aircraft fire over Germany. The shell exploded under his engine, blowing off half the cowling and destroying several cylinders. Black smoke poured from the engine. Any liquid-cooled engine would have seized immediately. But the P-47's air-cooled radial engine kept running on the remaining good cylinders. Gladich flew his damaged Thunderbolt over 200 miles back to England, landed safely, and walked away. The P-47 with no tail. In late 1944, a P-47 pilot was hit by German anti-aircraft fire that destroyed his entire vertical stabilizer, the tail fin. According to all principles of aerodynamics, the plane should have been uncontrollable and crashed immediately. But the P-47 was so large and heavy, with so much inherent stability, that the pilot was able to maintain some control using the ailerons and throttle. He made it back to England and executed a landing, fast and barely controlled but survivable. These weren't isolated incidents. P-47 pilots routinely brought home aircraft with engines with multiple cylinders destroyed, wings with massive holes. Control surfaces shot away, landing gear damaged or destroyed. Fuselage riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, the P-47's construction was massively over-engineered. Republic built the airframe to handle stresses far beyond normal flight operations. The radial engine had 18 cylinders. If a few were destroyed, the others could keep it running. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. The pilot sat in an armored tub. German pilots learned quickly. Even if you hit a P-47, it probably won't go down. You need to hit it hard and repeatedly, or better yet, avoid fighting it entirely. Ground attack, the Thunderbolt's second career. While the P-47 made its name as an air superiority fighter, it discovered a second calling, ground attack. In late 1943 and throughout 1944, as Allied air superiority was established over Europe, P-47s increasingly took on ground attack missions. They would strafe German trains, trucks, tanks, troop positions, airfields, anything that moved or looked important. And the P-47 was perfect for this role. Ruggedness ground attack meant flying low where anti-aircraft fire was heavy. The P-47 could take hits that would destroy other fighters. Firepower, those 850 caliber guns that were deadly against aircraft were equally devastating against ground targets. They could punch through locomotive boilers, truck engines, even light tank armor. Bomb load. The P-47 could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, as much as many light bombers. Equipped with bombs or rockets, a P-47 could destroy bridges, buildings, and fortifications. Speed at low level. While heavy at altitude, the P-47's powerful engine gave it excellent low-level speed. Critical for ground attack work where you needed to get in and out fast. P-47 pilots became experts at train busting, finding German locomotives and destroying them. A burst from 850 calibers into a locomotive's boiler would cause it to explode spectacularly. German rail traffic in occupied France was decimated by marauding thunderbolts. During the D-Day invasion in June 1944, P-47s flew close air support missions, attacking German positions, tanks, and reinforcements. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later said the P-47 was one of the most important weapons in the Allied victory. One German soldier interviewed after the war described the terror of being attacked by P-47s. You would hear them coming, that distinctive sound of the big radial engine. Then you would see them, huge dark shapes diving from the sky. Then the sound of the guns like 1,000 saws cutting metal. Trucks would explode, men would be torn apart, and the P-47s would be gone before you could even shoot back. We feared them more than the bombers. The Pacific Theater. Thunderbolts in the Pacific. While the P-47's greatest fame came in Europe, it also served with distinction in the Pacific Theater. Though it's often overshadowed by the P-38 Lightning and P-51 Mustang in histories of that campaign. The P-47 arrived in the Pacific in late 1943, and it brought capabilities that were perfect for the unique challenges of that theater. Rugged engine. The jungle environment, with its humidity, rain, and poor quality fuel, was hard on liquid-cooled engines. The P-47's air-cooled radial thrived. Ground attack. In the Pacific, air-to-air combat was less frequent, but ground attack against Japanese positions was crucial. The P-47 excelled at this. Survivability. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was intense. The P-47 could take hits and keep flying, critical when you're flying over jungle with no place to make an emergency landing. The 5th Air Force, operating in New Guinea and the Philippines under General George Kenney, used P-47s extensively for ground attack. They destroyed Japanese airfields, supply depots, and troop concentrations. One particularly famous mission occurred in April 1945 when P-47s from the 318th Fighter Group destroyed over 100 Japanese aircraft on the ground at Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo. One of the most successful single-mission destruction tallies of the war. Pacific Theater P-47 pilots appreciated the big fighter's toughness. One pilot recalled, "I took hits from Japanese 20mm cannons that blew holes in my wings big enough to crawl through. The P-47 got me home. Any other fighter, I'd be swimming in the Pacific or rotting in a jungle. The numbers don't lie. By the end of World War II, the statistics told the story of the P-47's effectiveness. Production 15,086 P-47s were built, more than any other American fighter except the P-51 Mustang. This massive production reflected how valued the aircraft was. Air-to-air kills. P-47 pilots were credited with destroying 3,752 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. While this is less than the P-51's total, it's still an impressive figure, especially considering many P-47s shifted to ground attack roles in the later war. Ground targets destroyed. P-47s destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, 68,000 trucks, 6,000 armored vehicles. Thousands of buildings, bridges, and other targets. Loss rate. The P-47 had one of the lowest loss rates of any American fighter, about 0.7 losses per 1,000 sorties. This reflected its ruggedness and survivability. Pilot survival rate. P-47 pilots had a higher survival rate than pilots of most other fighters. When a P-47 was hit, it usually kept flying long enough to get the pilot home or at least over friendly territory. Top aces. Many of America's top aces flew the P-47, including Francis Gabreski, 28 kills; Robert S. Johnson, 27 kills; David Schilling, 22.5 kills; Fred Christensen, 21.5 kills. These numbers demonstrated beyond doubt that the aircraft Germany's pilots initially mocked had become one of the most effective fighters of the war. German perspective. Fear and respect. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Allied air superiority was total. German pilots, often poorly trained replacement pilots, were being thrown into combat against overwhelming numbers of American and British fighters. But even experienced German aces, when asked after the war which Allied fighter they feared most, frequently named the P-47. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a German ace who survived the war, wrote in his memoir, "The American Thunderbolt was a formidable opponent. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was nearly impossible to defeat. Its firepower was overwhelming. Its ability to absorb damage was frightening. And it was faster than we expected." Johannes Steinhoff, another German ace, said, "Early in the war, we looked down on American fighters. They seemed crude compared to our precision-engineered aircraft. But the P-47 taught us that American engineering had different priorities: brute strength, overwhelming firepower, and pilot survival. In the end, these priorities proved just as effective as our approach." By the war's end, German fighter pilots had learned hard lessons about the P-47. It wasn't slow. At altitude, it was as fast or faster than German fighters. It wasn't clumsy. Skilled pilots could make it perform aerobatics that seemed impossible. It wasn't fragile. It could absorb damage that would destroy other fighters. It wasn't poorly armed. Its .850 caliber guns were the most effective armament of any fighter. The aircraft they'd mocked in 1943 had become by 1945 a symbol of American air power and one of the most feared aircraft in the sky. Legacy: the Thunderbolt's impact. The P-47. Thunderbolt left a lasting legacy that extended far beyond World War II, post-war service. The P-47 continued to serve with many air forces after wwii, including U.S. Air National Guard units through the 1950s, Latin American Air Forces through the 1960s. Some air forces flew P-47s into the 1970s design philosophy. The P-47 proved that bigger, heavier fighters could be effective, a lesson that influenced post-war jet fighter design. The emphasis on ruggedness, firepower, and pilot protection became hallmarks of American fighter design. Cultural icon. The P-47 became a symbol of American air power. It appeared in countless films, books, and documentaries about Wei Twun. Veterans organizations preserved several P-47s which still fly at air shows today. Survivors. About 30 P-47s survive today, with several still in flying condition. When a restored P-47 performs at an air show, the distinctive sound of that massive radial engine and the sight of that rugged, purposeful fighter still draws crowds. The men who flew them. Ultimately, the P-47's success was due to the pilots who flew it and learned to use its unique characteristics effectively. These men came from all backgrounds: farm boys from the Midwest, city kids from New York, immigrant sons seeking to prove their loyalty. Everyone united by the desire to defeat Nazi Germany. They learned to love the big, heavy fighter that initially seemed so ungainly. They learned to trust it to bring them home when damaged. They learned to use its devastating firepower to deadly effect. As one P-47 pilot put it, the Thunderbolt wasn't beautiful like the Spitfire or sleek like the Mustang. It was big, brutish, and practical. It was like the difference between a racehorse and a plow horse. But I'd take a plow horse any day if I knew it would get me home alive. Another pilot said, "When you're 25,000 feet over Germany, surrounded by flak and enemy fighters, you don't care how your plane looks. You care if it's fast enough to catch the enemy, if its guns can kill them, and if it's tough enough to take hits and keep flying." The P-47 was all of those things. It was the best friend a fighter pilot could have. Conclusion. From mockery to mastery. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is a story of redemption and vindication. It began as an aircraft that defied conventional wisdom. Too big, too heavy, too different from what a fighter should be. German pilots saw it and laughed, confident their sleek, nimble fighters would make short work of these American jugs. But the Germans stopped laughing. They stopped laughing when P-47s dove on them at speeds they couldn't match. They stopped laughing when 850 caliber machine guns tore their aircraft apart. They stopped laughing when the P-47s they'd shot up full of holes kept flying and made it home. They stopped laughing when American pilots mastered the Thunderbolt and turned it into one of the most deadly fighters in the sky. The P-47 Thunderbolt proved that there's more than one way to build a successful fighter. You don't need to be the lightest or the most maneuverable. You don't need to follow conventional design wisdom. What you need is the right combination of characteristics for the mission: speed, firepower, ruggedness, and the ability to keep your pilot alive. The P-47 had all of these in abundance. From its first combat missions in 1943 to its final operations at the war's end, the P-47 Thunderbolt compiled one of the most impressive records of any fighter aircraft in history. It destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground. It supported ground forces through crucial battles. It brought thousands of pilots home alive when lesser aircraft would have failed. And it earned the respect, grudging at first, then genuine, of the German pilots who faced it in combat. The aircraft they mocked became the aircraft they feared. The Jug, the flying beer barrel. The fighter that was too big and too heavy became Thunder, the sound of 850 caliber machine guns raining lead from above. That's the legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt. A fighter that proved the doubters wrong. A fighter that brought its pilots home. A fighter that helped win the war. And a fighter that German pilots learned too late never to laugh at again.